Robservations with Robert Meyer Burnett.
So I've been thinking a lot about, as we do on this channel, storytelling. Let's talk about storytelling. Why do we like storytelling? Why do we listen to stories? Well, I've said on the show a million times, because I think storytelling is the easiest way we can share the human experience with one another. I mean, think about it. Everybody's a storyteller. You know, you convey information. Guess what happened last night? Then you tell the story. Everybody tells the story all the time of their lives to other people. And I think the one thing that we all want, I think the universal constant about storytelling is we all want great stories that have great characters and great, endings. Whether they're with people that you know, or whether they're fictional characters that have been made up, or if you're reading historical fiction or historical nonfiction and it's recounting the battle of whatever. We all want those stories to be great stories, no matter what they are. And now, in a way, we live in a world where stories are around us all the time. And I think for our genre community, for us imagination connoisseurs, we, the imagination connoisseurs of the world, we are storytelling connoisseurs as well. I mean, I say imagination because it opens it's not just about necessarily stories on television or stories in comics or stories on the movie screen, stories in video games, wherever. It's all stories everywhere. But to really love stories, you have to have a wonderful imagination. I'd like to think. Well, I found this article on Quillette, and I thought it was really interesting. Quillette is a website. I mean, don't throw at me, Rob. There's a certain leaning to Quillette. I don't necessarily think that's true. They bill themselves as journalism, philosophy, politics. I look for stories. You know me. I'm always looking for stories to share with you. And there was a really interesting article that was published on February 16th by Jacob Falkovich, and I wanted to share it. I thought it was really interesting. Now, it doesn't necessarily pertain to movies and television directly, but it certainly does indirectly. And I want to read this. I don't know if I'll read the whole article, but I did want to share this article with you. And I definitely think that it's worth sharing, because it is. Oh, and you know what I just did? I just blasted, for whatever reason, the article from from my lovely graphic, and I don't know where it's gone. So let me bear with me. Live television, you never know what's going to happen, or live streaming. Let me just put the article back where I had it so I could share it with you now. Yeah. So we shall see. Well, apparently I'm not doing a very good job of sharing my screen, and I don't understand why. What can you do? What can you do? You just have to keep looking, keep making it work live. Just go with it. Keep babbling on and on and on. So yeah, I really enjoyed this story, and I'm going to share it with you now. Ah, good, got it back. I'm going to keep it. I'm going to go full frame for a while as I read this. Here it is. It is the story once again. Let me give it to you. It's written by Jacob Falkovich. It is called The Narrative and Its Discontents. Human history in 2 sentences. Pre-modern times, material goods were hard to come by, but small communities offered kinship, and their traditions made the world meaningful and comprehensible. Today, physical comforts are plentiful, but belonging and sense-making are scarce. Belonging and sense-making are made of the same raw material, stories, and shared stories are what bring any group larger than a family together, be it Brazilians, Buddhists, or Beliebers. Stories build a shared reality that in turn frames how we interpret the world in our own minds. A story that illuminates reality and unites people will create both belonging and meaning. And thus, all humans converge collectively on the truest possible story of the world and themselves and live happily ever after. Wait, that's not what happened. So what happened? One of the things that happened to the stories was mimetics. Stories proliferate or decline based on their own Darwinian logic. They may reproduce if they're funny, or if they flatter the listener, or if they're set to a catchy tune. Consider my simplified story of history. Isn't it pleasing in its symmetry? Doesn't both eras have their benefits and challenges sound like something a sophisticated person would say? But mimetics isn't inherently hostile to truth and unity. It produces Harambe, not Lysenkoism. Stories like Soviet agronomics are corrupted by power. If only stories bring society together, those who tell the stories get to rule them. Even Elon Musk, renowned for his building physical things, said that he who controls the memes controls the universe. To a first approximation, the capital N narrative running our society is written by the prestige legacy media, which receives the narrative from experts in academia and government and spreads it with the help of Hollywood and the education system. What do journalists, academicians, bureaucrats, filmmakers, and teachers have in common? They mostly hail from the middle and upper middle classes, mostly have university degrees, and mostly vote Democrat. But those attributes by themselves fail to explain why they are so conspicuously always on the same page with respect to the narrative, even as it changes and mutates. What ultimately unites all of these people is that they care and believe what the legacy media writes. And the media writes whatever maintains the narrative's elites in positions of power and authority. They are bound, like the Nazgul, to the One Ring. Consider, for example, a Washington Post story about a New York University report calling claims of conservative censorship on social media a form of disinformation. The report says, the claim of anti-conservative animus is itself a form of disinformation, a falsehood with no reliable evidence to support it. No trustworthy, large-scale studies have determined that conservative content is being removed for ideological reasons. What does no reliable evidence mean? Wikipedia has a list of notable social media suspensions. One could reliably count the conservatives included, but Wikipedia doesn't count. Reliable evidence is evidence that would be accepted for policy guidance purposes by the Nazgul, government bureaucracy. For example, a large-scale study performed by Nazgul Elite University and deemed trustworthy by Nazgul, the Washington Post, everything within the narrative, nothing against the narrative, nothing outside the narrative. The report concludes with a call to establish a new digital regulatory agency. Not a day passes without the papers demanding regulation of tech or finance or homeschooling, but never academia or journalism. Regulation is the most direct exercise of power by the people of the narrative over those not directly bound to it. The former are not bad people. They secured their positions in institutions by thinking and speaking exclusively within the narrative, and within it they see themselves fighting for truth and justice. The narrative isn't inherently against truth or justice, or even conservatives. It's just against disinformation. That is, any counter-narrative. It has other names for it too: conspiracy, propaganda, fake news. So you can see where this is going. And I think absolutely it is quite a legitimate examination of this phenomenon, definitely. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. I bet you thought that I was going to go spinning off into some weird political discourse. No. What I wanted to talk about was the narrative as it relates to our favorite franchises. We have a narrative. We have a narrative that we expect to happen, and we expect it to happen the way that we want it to happen. And I was thinking about it in terms of Star Trek. Like, as I was reading this article, I'm thinking, oh, so I am I've become the conservative in terms of the Star Trek narrative that I want to see. Is that what's happening to me? Have I become implacable? Am I somebody that is so... And then I thought to myself, no, that isn't it. Because this story is talking about the narrative as if something is more of a political discourse. But here's the thing. When you remove the narrative, the stories that we want, well, they just have to be good stories that are true to themselves, true to what they are. And it got me thinking about Star Wars. And I was thinking, well, why was it that when Luke Skywalker shows up at the end of The Mandalorian, why was that so satisfying? Oops, spoiler alert. He does. Luke Skywalker shows up at the end of The Mandalorian Season 2, wrecking shop, saving our heroes, and taking Grogu away to presumably begin Jedi training. Why was that so satisfying? Well, because, like with Cinefex magazine, Star Wars has been around in my life, well, now for 44 years, since 1977. And it really meant something to me. And I realized that the narrative that Star Wars was telling was pretty straightforward. It harked back to Joseph Campbell. Maybe just it harked back to storytelling forms that we as human beings have understood for millennia. And that's why we loved Star Wars. And I think what's really interesting is we believe that there's a certain way a Star Wars story is supposed to unfold as we understood it. And that narrative is based on 3 movies: Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. Now, I've often had a problem with Return of the Jedi. I've talked about it. I found Return of the Jedi lacking, especially after Star Wars and Empire. However, the chart, or the course that Luke charts through those 3 films, by the time you get to the end, his confrontation with the Emperor and Vader is highly satisfying as far as that narrative, the narrative of Luke Skywalker. And after all, people have said later that the Skywalker saga is the story of Darth Vader and his fall and redemption. I don't think it is. The first 3 movies, they didn't know there was going to be any more. So if you just concern yourself with the Star Wars original trilogy, it was a narrative of Luke Skywalker. It was about a simple boy that was drawn into the maelstrom of the rest of the universe, and he had to find himself, and he had to find his own strength in order to overcome, redeem his father, and at the same time discover what he himself believed in. And when we left him at the end of Return of the Jedi, we realized that here was a boy that was forged into a man, and now he is ready to face the universe and do great things. That's the narrative. That's Luke's narrative. Now, what a great narrative. Now, what I found very interesting, for whatever reason, we now live in a time where that narrative, which is a positive narrative, it's a narrative that is inherently something that is aspirational. Makes you feel good when you get to the end of it. When you get to Return of the Jedi and Luke throws away his lightsaber, no, I'll never join you. The Emperor's like, come here, boy. No, not gonna do it. Wouldn't be prudent. This is a triumphant moment of the kind of narratives that are the best, that leave us with, we've watched 6 hours, 3 movies over the course of 6 years waiting to get to the end of this narrative, and it was hugely satisfying. Darth Vader is redeemed. Luke is a man. Luke shows that he can spare the life of one of the greatest villains perhaps ever in all of pop culture history throughout the last 2,000 years, and it's fantastic. And it's gratifying. And that's what we want from our narratives. That's why we're imagination connoisseurs in the first place, because these narratives bring us joy. Doctor Who, Star Trek, James Bond. And when you're working in the narrative, when you're part of it, when you're a writer, you're a director, you're a producer, your job, the job, is to continue the narrative and bring people that kind of elation, or at least understanding or catharsis, or whatever it is that you're trying to do with the story that you're trying to tell. And so what's really important is to remember, what kind of a story are you working in? What is the narrative form that you have immersed yourself in? And I think one of the interesting things, and I've talked about this a lot on this show, is the narratives that we have all loved and immersed ourselves in our whole lives are being changed and altered in a mistaken bid to try and, I guess, tell us things that weren't inherently in the narratives to begin with. Like, I don't really understand what has changed, why it's changed, because the great narratives that have endured over the years, over the decades, over the centuries, those narratives have certain things in common. They don't even have to end. They can be tragic narratives. But even a great tragedy can be almost just as enjoyable and just as insightful as a great triumphant narrative. You know, I mean, it just depends. Is the narrative true to itself? That is what's very important. And I think one of the things that we've seen is there are forces at work in our society now that are telling us that our narratives have some kind of a problem. Our narratives are naive. Our narratives are letting us down. They're not addressing the cause du jour. And I would say that, well, the great narratives shouldn't be concerned with the cause du jour, your cause or anyone's cause. The great narratives should be concerned, as they always have been and always will be, with the great human truths. That's what our narratives should be about. And do they give us those things? And I think at the end of the day, does the Star Wars narrative give us something that's necessarily insightful into the human condition? That's debatable. I mean, you as Luke did on Dagobah when he went into the tree cave. What do you take with? What's in there? Only what you take with you. I think that's true of a lot of stories. You know, the consumer of a story has to bring certain things with them as they experience it to get the most out of these narratives, which I think is quite important. But really, I think at the end of the day, narratives are supposed to, in my mind, reinforce, well, how good it is to be alive, how good it is to be a part of the human species. And the great narratives can be shared by everyone. It doesn't matter what your economic level is or your level of education. I mean, sure, these things might help you appreciate the great narratives, but the great narratives are for all. They are for everyone. And they will always be for everyone. And the great narratives are those that have those truths, those human truths that surpass or transcend the day and the time in which they're told. And I think that's the secret to any narrative. Even the story yesterday, Zack Snyder's The Snyder Cut, that in itself has now become a narrative. Not the movie, but the story of the Snyder Cut. Everything that happened. A great tragedy. Troops rallying to the defense of not just a man, but of art, against a publicly held corporation that would never acknowledge wrongdoing or anything. I mean, you could call it what you want, but the narrative of the actual Snyder Cut and the making of the Snyder Cut itself becomes one of the great narratives that people will tell in the entertainment business for years to come. And I think that's pretty cool. I think that, whether or not Zack Snyder's Justice League, the film, is hugely satisfying for everyone, and I'm sure I'm already expecting it's going to be a very divisive film, but now what the Snyder Cut has that very few films before it have, is its own making of narrative that became in itself one of the great stories about triumph of the human spirit, which is kind of fun and kind of unique and kind of interesting. And I'll tell you something, the story of the making of the Snyder Cut and how it got here is far more satisfying to me as a narrative than the last 3 seasons of Star Trek Discovery, which is a narrative that basically subverts the entire meaning of Star Trek, which I'll never understand. But there's some interesting things that I wanted to finally read about the ending of this article. I wanted to continue to share because I find it interesting. As Metz writes, the community includes a wide cross-section of viewpoints, from communist to anarcho-capitalist, religiously from Catholic to atheist. This isn't from an effort to signal our diversity or open-mindedness, but because a person's labels are considered much less important than their argument on its merits. Rationalists don't presume infallibility, but the opposite, that we are inevitably wrong and biased even as we seek to improve. Our online hub is called Less Wrong, but it is an aspiration, not a brag. The mindset is nigh incomprehensible to people of the narrative who are used to being guided by a single source of truth enforced by social consensus. Who is against the narrative? With rationalists who are outside it. It is only from outside that one can try and explain the narrative, as I have attempted to do here. If you think that the narrative doesn't make sense, your choices fall into 3 broad categories. You can seek to reform the institutions that produce it, as many academics and journalists are bravely attempting. You can fight to topple and replace it, or myriad other challenges, or you can step on the difficult path to rationality and try and make some sense of the world with the power of your own reason. Let me put this whole thing into the live chat so you can read this. But don't necessarily read it as something about political ideology, but just think about it. Think about it in terms of the stories that we love. The stories of science fiction, fantasy, horror. The stories that appear in comics and video games, and manga. Well, those are comics too. Movies and TV. Why do we love these stories? And the important thing is, when we encounter stories that are a part of the narrative that don't seem to jibe, like Star Trek Discovery, or like The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, we have to know not just that we don't like them, but why we don't like them. Why don't they work within the context of the larger narratives of those forms? After all, Star Wars, while it does belong to a larger genre, is a genre unto itself. So is Doctor Who. So is Star Trek. So is James Bond. James Bond is part of the James Bond genre. Sure, you could say it's about spy thrillers as well, but really, James Bond is his own thing, just like Doctor Who is his and her own thing. It just depends. And when we see these narratives, we know whether they're good or bad. But the important thing is to know why, and to understand why is it that the people or the stewards of these narratives don't seem to understand exactly what they are.